Good morning. It is a welcome thing to be able to be with you this day and hear these familiar scripture passages. Last week when I was teaching the little kids, I introduced the story about David being chosen to be the next king by Samuel, lining up all the brothers. And one of the kids, actually two of the little kids, shouted out immediately, "And he beat Goliath." Even the kids know this story about David and Goliath. And you didn't hear the section, but for 40 days, the Philistines kept sending out the giant Goliath. And they would sing a hymn to taunt the people of Israel whenever they sent Goliath out. It was rediscovered in the 70s, but for some reason, the song didn't make the hymnal. I don't know why, but I'm of a certain age, and so you might be too. If you recognize this, sing along with me if you wish. You don't tug on Superman's cape. You don't spit into the wind. You don't pull the mask off the old Lone Ranger, and you don't mess around with Goliath. Well, apologies to Jim Croce, but you get the point. As they taunted the people of Israel, don't mess around with our giant. You'll never win. And when David volunteers to go fight, even his own King Saul says, you're too small, you're too young, you're not a warrior. This guy's been beating up everybody. But David persisted, and so they say, okay, go on, let them eat you alive. And so they try to put Saul's armor, King Saul's armor, on little boy David. And of course, we all know the cartoon picture of the armor going on. The kid can't even raise his arms. And finally, he takes it off and says, look, all I need are 5 smooth stones and a slingshot. Can David win that battle? Against the giant Goliath? Alone, we know he doesn't stand a chance. But he tells Goliath, you've been taunting my God. And when I go into battle, I have God with me. On my own, I have no chance, but you're fighting against the God that I worship. And God plus you are sufficient for any battle. Today, we've been thinking about all the giants that we battle, which seem to be too large, too huge to defeat. And for some of us, the isolation of the past year itself has made us feel completely alone, despite any ideas that we might have thought about God's with me and everything. When you spend 15 months isolated, it can wear on you. And that sense of isolation has been too much for some of us. Others who fight addiction of all sorts have had an even harder time this year because of their groups not meeting, not having the regular contact, and all of that has made people with addictions even more vulnerable. Some with jobs that seemed to be really good jobs a year ago before the pandemic, now the jobs have seemed overly stressful. Some of you teach school, or some of you had to teach your kids while doing your other job from home. All of those things added up to lots and lots of stress for people. Or maybe you came back and now the job you thought was okay really doesn't pay enough anymore to meet the bills in an age when the bills seem to be getting higher. Or some of us had illnesses or still have illnesses and they're vulnerable. And now we read about new variants of the COVID virus being on the way, and we worry, do we have enough armor? Do we have enough armor for all these battles that we're fighting? For the giants that seem to want to have their way with our world? Do we have enough armor, or is our slingshot really enough? In this last year, I think for a lot of us who have been paying attention as best we can, we've recognized that there are lots of other battles being fought in the world around us that we might have wanted to duck because we might have said, well, that's not our fight. And yet, our faith tradition, the words of the book that we use here on Sunday mornings, that book tells us otherwise. Remember, Jesus told a story about who was the one who helped out on the side of the road? It was the Samaritan, right? Who actually came and took care of someone who was wounded, who took care of one who was another. And it was in response to the lawyer wanting to know, well, who is our neighbor? And the answer became obvious to all of us. Anyone who is in need, anyone who is struggling, anyone in this world is really our brother and sister in God's creation. So as we started to recognize the vestiges of racism and oppression, the leftover problems that had been going on from slavery onward, and that problems continued after slavery ended, oppression, in every way, racism ended up being part of the problem that we had to address and face. And 3 days ago, when I was working on this sermon, I was reminded that it was 6 years ago this week when someone went in, Dylan Roof went in and shot and murdered people in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, and opened all of our eyes to something that was not an isolated event, but something that was happening all the time. And it really forced a number of us to wake up and say, we need to know more about our own history, we need to search our own souls, and we need to search the soul of this church and this nation. And we've been on a journey to look at the issues of race and justice that have never been healed. And in the process, guided by our own parish historian, we recognize that even our own parish, Old Donation, back in the 18th century, owned, bought, and sold people. So as we started looking at all those things, we started to realize that we had work to do, both to understand the present by knowing the past, but also charting a way into the future. And the first step for us was to engage in this work of Sacred Ground Circles, which is a study program that helps us to know the truth. It begins by knowing the truth of our history, follows with proclaiming the dream of God's beloved community. Third, working to repair the breach that has been created sometimes by ourselves. And then fourth of all, practicing the way. 4 quadrants of elements of what it means to become a beloved community. And it starts with history. And we found as we did this work that many of us did not know the truth. I'm reminded that when I was in high school in Harrisonburg, my sisters and brother and I were going to school and studying Virginia history, and some of us came back with school lessons to tell our parents about how we didn't realize this, but when the Civil War ended, that the slaves were not really all that upset. In fact, some of them were upset that they had been on the losing side because their masters had treated them so well. My father, being a little bit of a cynical one, that you might recognize that trait in me, said, don't listen to all the crap that they try to teach you in school, because some of it is not true. And it was the closest I ever had the experience of him using anything anywhere close to profanity when he said crap. But it expressed how much of a concern he had. And he taught us that if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. Some of the reading I've been doing in the last year have said from people, history may not repeat exactly, but history has echoes that continue to make noise into the future. And if you don't know and you don't solve the problems of the past and repair the open wounds, then in fact, the future cannot ever be what it's supposed to be. Or Christians know this. Actually, the book we use tells us that the sins of the fathers will be exacted upon the second and third generations. None of us are excused from not knowing what has happened and what role we had and taking work to do the reparation, the repairing of the breach. Christians are people of truth, we've been saying for this past year, and it seems like that is a debatable issue today, but I argue truth is not a question or a political issue. For Christians, truth is the essence of how we live. Jesus himself says, I am the truth. And when you come to me, you should know that you will be exposed with the truth right in front of you when you come with the open mind. And Christians can handle the truth. In fact, there have been 51 of us involved in the Sacred Ground studies. Part of the problem we have today in our own age is that we have this idea that it has to be either or. There's this binary system that we're saying either this is true or this is true, when in reality, both can be true. F. Scott Fitzgerald, the writer, says, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Two different ideas that might seem in opposition can both be true. And it's actually an example of Christian theology and thought. St. Paul can say, I am a saint, created by God. God's image and likeness is who we are. And yet, I, Paul, am the worst of all sinners. He will say those things in one breath after the other. Martin Luther said that is a key doctrine, which is that all of us are simultaneously saint and sinner. And I know that because I can say with all honesty, I am Bob, I am a child of God, created to be the best in the world, and I try to be the very best. I try to be guided by the Holy Spirit in every decision, and yet at the same time, every day I sin in things done or left undone. Things that I know I should take care of and I don't. And I know that the toughest giant that I have to beat is the guy that I see in the mirror every Monday, every single morning. Our history, in the same way, is both are true. This nation of the United States is the best nation, I would argue with anybody, it's the best that's ever been in existence in terms of its ideals, in terms of what it tries to do, and how much good it does in the world. It is the best. However, it is also true that while it is the best, it also is flawed. And some of the very worst things that it could have done, it has done, either personally, individually, and systematically, legally. Both are true. I know that this is the greatest nation. I also know that it has a lot of things it has done wrong and continues to do wrong. And there is much work to do to make it. As Amanda Gorman said, America is not broken, but it's not finished. The same as for you and for me. When we know our own soul and we know our own heart and we examine with honesty our own life, we know that on one hand, God has created us with all these blessings, all these skills and talents, all this potential, and at the same time, we also are flawed human beings who are also prone to failing. The question is, how do we create? How do we become part with God? How do we partner with His work of creating a beloved community where we live on earth as it is in heaven? What do we do? So the second thing our groups understood as they finished this study of the history is that what we see in the past has caused us to be where we are in the present, and also gives us a roadmap for repairing the breach to move into the future. And so we knew we had to act. Now, individually or even corporately as Older Nation, it might feel like it's David fighting Goliath. But we know from last week too, Jesus said, what good is a little mustard seed, right? Are we enough? Well, with God, we can make a difference. And members of that group initiated a scholarship called the Repairing the Breach Scholarship, the Rachel Scholarship, and established a partnership with Norfolk State University so that students in the 3rd or 4th year would be granted a scholarship from Old Nation that's awarded by Norfolk State to be able to help them through their program to graduate. 3rd or 4th years, because those are the years where it gets the toughest for people who don't always have the resources, but actually are very excellent students and need some more help. So we can be part of that. And so for the next 5 years, we committed a $5,000 a year scholarship fund that Norfolk State can use in those instances. And we do it in the name of Rachel. Rachel, the one person that we have identified from the vestry minutes on my coffee table from the 1700s, Rachel was the name of a person that this parish bought and sold. If you want to be joined in with us on that work, we love donations, and because our hope is that the $25,000 gift that established the fund will grow and grow, and you can be part of that, like all of us will be part of making that fund do more than just $5,000 a year and more than 5 years, because we want to be in this game for the long haul. And if you don't understand why we do it, and you don't understand what in the world am I talking about, join Sacred Ground Circles in the fall, because they'll start up with new studies. And if you understand right now already why I'm saying this, join in. Part of the thing that I'm trying to do is help us all understand the world that we live in from a Christian viewpoint. And on Father's Day, I remember how I learned some of those lessons from my own dad. How I found him when I was a young man wildly inconsistent. He was someone who seemed to be conservative in almost every respect, lifelong Republican, conservative fiscally, never spent money on much of anything, believed you should always have the cash before you spent anything. But I realized at some point that he was someone who was very conservative, and he was involved in all sorts of issues that others might have identified as being liberal issues. And he lived his life the way my New Testament professor, Kathy Grebe, always said, which is, for Christians, the labels of the world are irrelevant. Because actually, I found that this guy that seemed to be very, very conservative also celebrated the very first Earth Day, he proudly told us for years. He was in civil rights marches. He was somebody who chose to go to integrated churches everywhere he lived. He built relationships. We had black families and friends in our home, and we in their home, people that we knew from church relationships. And one of the things about my dad is he always had the most boring of cars because he didn't like to spend money. And so he always bought Ford Falcons, which if you're of a certain age, you know that was about as boring a car, small, underpowered, but he bought one fancy car. One fancy car in his whole life. It was while we lived in Cumberland. He had moved there a year before we could because we were in Rhode Island still selling the house. So when he moved to Cumberland, Maryland, instead of the two larger, primarily white congregations, he joined the historically black congregation, St. Philip's in Cumberland. And he taught Sunday school there for a year before we ever moved to town. And he bought this convertible, a large, long Buick convertible that he would drive on Sunday mornings to go to Sunday school teaching it at St. Philip's. Before later, when we finally moved there, he'd go across town, pick us up, and bring us to Holy Cross, where we went to church. And I didn't realize for a while what was the deal with the convertible, which we thought was really cool. It was because the first thing he did in the morning on Sunday was he drove the convertible over into the housing project in Cumberland and picked up Mrs. Powell, who was his co-teacher with the Sunday school team at St. Philip's. And then he put down the top of the convertible and they loaded in every little black kid that they could from the projects. And then he drove down Main Street, Baltimore Avenue in Cumberland, all the way up the main drag in front of all the businesses, all the other churches. And he wanted to make sure that they saw him, Lily White, Mrs. Powell, black as you could get, and a carload of black kids on the way to church. And he said, I just want to make sure people knew it was a new age. It was a new world. We were going to make a different world. He was doing the work of repairing the breach before we ever had language for it. Because his ethics, all that he did was based upon his faith, influenced by a heart that God was making. And he taught me how to have an open mind. And part of the problem that we have today is oftentimes who guides our mind? Who do we allow to be the first influence? My father knew that his ethics, his decisions had to be based first upon what the gospel said. I think our narrative these days too often is our favorite TV show on cable news network. And I hope instead, I pray that it's not blue or red, but rather the primary narrative that drives our choices becomes that guy that we study in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That I want to be living a life that looks like Jesus. I want to tug on Superman's cape and spit in the wind. I'm willing to mess around with Goliath. Because I know when I'm on God's team, I am never alone. And my earthly father showed me how. And my Father in heaven still is showing me what it means to live so that we see on earth what we will later see when we live in heaven. So moms and dads, on this Father's Day, I pray that you will teach your children the same lessons that I keep hearing from my Heavenly Father each and every day. And go ahead, tug on Goliath's cape. He can't win.